Hi students, so in this video we are going to look at the way that poverty is measured, and I'm going to propose to you from the beginning when you're reading the section in the textbook that is assigned this week about disparities between wealth and poverty in our nation and in the world. Please analyze the perspective that's presented and tell me whether it might possibly, at least possibly, have a Western bias to it. Regarding poverty and what the necessities are that we need to survive on a daily basis. So one of the things that you'll read in the section of chapter 6 that is assigned this week is that poverty has multiple dimensions that are used to measure it. And specifically, the United Nations has a subsidiary organization called the United Nations Habitat Program that you'll read about in this chapter. And that habitat program has this measurement that includes educational attainment, healthcare access, style of life as measurements of poverty. However, in general, when we look at poverty in sociology, we can't just define the word by itself. We have to put an adjective in front of it, and most commonly, we put the adjectives relative and absolute in front of this word poverty so that we understand and are able to differentiate between the two. So let's start with relative poverty, which is a very common type of poverty that you see in the United States. Relative poverty has to do with the resources that we have on a regular basis in our daily lives, in our home life, and through other resources we have around us. So for instance, do we have our basic needs met? With relative poverty, I guess we first need to say what our basic needs are. Traditionally, we say that our basic needs are food, potable water. It means that water is safe to drink, which means also that there are proper sanitation systems to carry away contaminants that could get into our drinking water supply. So food, clean water, and shelter. Now, shelter doesn't have to be an apartment, a condo, a duplex, a house. It can be a camper, it can be a tent, it can be a hut, it can be anything that is sufficient for you to be able to comfortably survive from one day to the next. So not every place has hailstorms and tornadoes and, bad weather. Some places have very predictable weather throughout the year, and you don't necessarily need the same kind of shelter in Los Angeles, California, for instance, that you need in Knoxville, Tennessee, where you have the four seasons hit you hard in Knoxville, Tennessee, and in Los Angeles, California, and thereabouts, you have pretty steady, beautiful, temperate weather throughout the year. Typically, you do. Okay, so relative poverty typically is the idea, and you can make sure that you include this in your notes, and notice also that I'm defining it slightly differently from the way the book is. So don't just rely on the book's definition, but listen to the way I'm defining it, because I want you to make this mental comparison and decide for yourself what should or shouldn't be in this definition. So relative poverty is the ability to provide yourself with all the basic necessities to survive from day to day, like food, potable water, and the appropriate shelter. But you can't live up to the basic standard of living in the place where you are. So in the United States, is it safe to assume that all of us around us, people we encounter on a daily basis, have some sort of shelter over our heads to go home to, an address to use on applications and stuff like this? Not everybody does. And so if, for instance, you live in a van or a tent down by the river or something, that might be perfectly appropriate shelter for you to survive on a day-to-day basis, but that's not the expected standard of living that people have. In the United States, the expected standard of living is that you have some sort of, we'll say, roof over our head, but that roof over our heads implies that we're going to have a hookup to electricity, a hookup to water, or a septic system, or a sewer system, or a well, or some kind of thing that brings potable water into our house, water we can brush our teeth with, wash our clothes with, wash our bodies with, and drink, and not get sick from it and die from contaminants that are in our water supply. So we have a lot of assumptions about standard of living. We also assume that people have some kind of telephone number. So many of us have cell phones these days. When you meet someone who doesn't have access to one, it stands out as a little bit odd, or, oh, we're taken aback just a little bit because they don't have that resource. If you've ever encountered that, or if it's odd to you to think about not having running water in your household, or hooked up to the sewer so you can flush a toilet and everything goes away and you don't have to see it again, or an electrical grid, hookup. So, whenever the electricity has been out, if you walk into the room and just like absent-mindedly flip on the switch before you realize, oh, the electricity's out, that's how much of an expectation electrical access is for our life. And that's something that we can use in a comparison to relative poverty situations. Relative poverty has food, potable water access, and shelter appropriate for survival, but not the other expected luxuries, I will say, that are included in our standard of living in the United States. Certain types and varieties of food, bottled water, or hooked up to the electrical grid, or transportation system other than our feet, or access to jobs or education. These kinds of things are not necessary for survival, but they are expectations in the average standard of living that we typically have in our heads about the human condition. So when we meet people who survive just fine from day to day, but under very different circumstances and life experiences than our own, or than the expected in the country where we are, that's when you have relative poverty. Okay, so you can provide yourself with the means to survive, but you can't live up to the expectations of your living standards that society has for everybody. Okay, so that's relative poverty. Very, very common. Absolute poverty is becoming more common in the United States, but it is safe to say, the most common form of poverty that you will see highlighted as social problems around the world. So around the world, we've already discussed the difference between first world and third world countries. In third world countries, or the underdeveloped world, you don't have things like electrical grid widely available, safe sanitation systems, or water treatment to make sure that the water supply is safe. You don't have these kinds of things. And so absolute poverty is, when you break it down as simply as you possibly can, absolute poverty is a situation in which you, the individual, you are not able to provide yourself with the necessary things that you need to survive from day to day. And the things that I include on that list, and where I stop when I'm writing a definition of it, is food, safe water or potable water, and proper shelter. So that's where I stop. Your textbook adds education and healthcare to it. I don't add education and healthcare to it in my personal definition of absolute poverty, because if you are not able to survive from day to day because your food and your water resources are not secure or sanitary, then it doesn't matter what education level you have, and your healthcare is not going to be effective if your water resources are what's making you sick to begin with. If you look at the top killer of people around the world, the top 10 killers on the list that the CDC puts out annually, and the World Bank puts out annually, the top 10 killers, the most common symptom is diarrhea as the most deadly symptom, something that's very, very preventable if you have clean water resources. So with absolute poverty, if your major problem is you are suffering from chronic diarrhea, your body will dehydrate so quickly, and you die from dehydration very, very quickly. And this can't you can't help that with medical care if the medical care doesn't also come with a stable, reliable supply of water and safe sanitation moving forward. If you go get medical care for your diarrhea and go right back to your inadequate housing, your inadequate water supply, your unsafe, unclean, non-potable water supply, then I don't care how much medication you take for your diarrhea, diarrhea is still going to kill you because your water supply is what is giving it to you right now. So absolute poverty might, the definition in our textbook might have a little bit of a Western bias to it. When you look at the list of human rights that we looked at a couple weeks ago in class, we already noted that healthcare is not listed as one of the human rights on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the UN put out, 10 years ago and revisits on a regular basis to try to add more things to it. So that's why I would question, and I am challenging you to question while you're reading these things in the textbook and while you're listening to me, maybe I have a bias, maybe the textbook has a bias, maybe you can, crunch it down and analyze these biases, because remember, a social problem is perception mainly. You have to perceive that a social problem exists, but what kind of biases drive that perception that you're using to analyze the situation? And so you really have to make sure that you have your ethnocentrism in check, in other words, when you're analyzing these topics. Now, on the board behind me, to close out this video, I wrote this on the board so I would make sure and remember to include this. One of the proposals that I have for you to consider about a Western bias regarding this topic is the fact that there is a country in Asia named Bhutan. This is how you spell it on the board behind me, Bhutan. And it's been about 30 years ago or so now. I can't remember exactly how long ago it was. But the prince, the emperor of Bhutan, declared that Bhutan was not going to participate in the same economic measurements that other countries of the world participate in. And you might have heard in a geography class or a history class, economics class, of a macro scale measurement called gross domestic product. It is a way of measuring the level that a country's development is, their economic import-export, the products that they produce, either within their borders or from corporations that are headquartered in their borders. And so it's a complex economic measurement that is very often used to compare countries of the world in relationship to each other. So it's a type of global stratification measurement, and it measures the country as a whole, not really the lifestyle of the people who live there. And so year after year, the country of Bhutan was measured as like the lowest on the list because they don't have industry, they don't have development, they do not have an electrical grid or widespread sanitary water systems or sanitation systems at all. They are, by Western standards, extremely impoverished. However, they are happily so, according to surveys and qualitative data that is collected annually. The prince or the emperor of Bhutan, about 30 years ago, established a competing measurement to the gross national product measurement, gross national happiness. It just makes me laugh to think about it. So they collected information about people's lifestyles, and they didn't have electricity, and they don't have housing like you and I expect, and they don't have cell phones, and they don't have water grid systems and all this kind of stuff. They don't have all of these things that you and I think of as absolutely necessary, but the residents within that country, the citizens within that country, describe themselves as extremely happy. They're extremely content with their simple daily lives, and they have very few stresses, and they have very few mental health conditions. They have very few social problems that we're studying about this semester, very few comparatively. And so the emperor decided that he would report annually to the international reporting agencies the happiness index. How happy are his citizens this particular time period? And so now we have this new measurement called gross national happiness, and I think you should look it up. I think you should. There's a couple of good videos. I might even curate one for you in our class for your required watching this week, because it can show us some of what I'm talking about in regards to that Western bias that colors our analysis of things if we use our own way of life as the standard measurement. So we should really be careful not to do that, in particular when we are looking globally at cultures different than our own, and perhaps we're applying our own standard to a cultural system that they just don't fit. They just don't mesh. Could be that they just don't mesh. So please watch this and everything else with a critical eye while you're reading. Be critical to see if there's any biases, and I look forward to your reaction papers, and I'll see you in our next videos.